This was not a situation of a patient calling you up and saying, I'd like to come in and be evaluated, right?
That's correct.
Now, doctor, let's start with the laboratory test. If one were looking for evidence of acute rheumatoid arthritis, and Your Honor, I have another document that we marked. It's got our page number 446. May this be then, I guess it's 508?
508.
And because I think it might go faster, I'm going to hold on to it and do the marking and then ask Mr. Fairtlow to put it up on the...
All right.
And may I approach to show the doctor?
Mr. Shapiro, do you have this item? Right.
Doctor, there is a lab test done for something called CRP. That's one of the tests, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's a yes?
Yes, it is.
And CRP is a protein that's generated from the liver, is it not?
Yes, it is.
And it can be generated in response to inflammation in the body, is that correct?
Yes, it can.
What was the result on that test?
That result was negative.
And in fact, if somebody had, and when I use the term acute, I'm talking about an onset, not a chronic problem, but one where you've got an onset of new symptoms or renewed pain, that kind of thing. You understand how I'm using the term?
Sure.
If one had an acute onset of a rheumatoid arthritis episode, one would expect to see a positive CRP very quickly, wouldn't you?
Typically, it should be elevated.
Within 12 to 24 hours, right? Is that correct?
That's correct.
And it would then come down only after the episode, the acute episode, had passed. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Now, there is something else called an RA quant test, right?
Right.
And that is another aspect of looking for a finding associated with rheumatoid arthritis, right?
That is correct.
And would it be accurate to say that the RA test is a slower test to show the presence of an acute episode of rheumatoid arthritis than the CRP test?
I think that would be fair.
Are you speculating, or do you actually have some understanding of this area?
The exact time course, I wouldn't claim to be an expert on.
I'm asking Mr. Fairtlow now to put this exhibit 508 up, and I've outlined in blue the two areas we've been talking about. Now, the first area, and Mr. Fairtlow's got it there, that's what we were talking about, this CRP, this liver-generated protein, right?
Correct.
And if we move to the right, where it says NEG, that's the test result, correct?
That's correct.
If we move to the next forward negative and go up a bit, there's some pre-printed information reference range. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And that is to give the doctor some indication of what you would expect in a healthy patient, right?
That is correct.
And so in this particular test for CRP quant, it's negative, which is exactly what you would expect in the healthy patient, right?
That is correct.
Now if we drop down to the next outlined area, RA quant, you see that?
Yes, I do.
And the result, doctor, that's a little mathematical symbol meaning less than 17.3 whatever units are being used, right?
That's correct.
And the reference range for a normal person would be any result which was less than 20.0, correct?
That's correct.
So again, a normal result for Mr. Simpson, isn't that correct?
That's correct.
And again, this would suggest that Mr. Simpson did not have an active episode of rheumatoid arthritis, correct?
It would be on that side.
And doctor, then you talked about something called a sedimentation rate test, right?
That's correct.
And that was done on the 17th, is that correct?
No, that was done on the 15th.
I'm sorry, the test results we're looking at, are you sure about that?
There was one done on the 15th and the 17th.
All right, if we could, Mr. Fairtlow, you see where it says date collected? There we go. That's to reference when the blood sample was drawn, right? Is that correct, doctor?
That's correct.
So this test, series of tests, is from a blood sample of Mr. Simpson's drawn on June 15th.
That's correct.
By the way, did Mr. Simpson grimace when blood was drawn on the 15th?
I wasn't in the room when he had his blood drawn, so I can't answer that.
All right, now, on this document, is there any reference to a sedimentation rate test?
No, there's not on this document.
Doctor, would you pull out whatever result you have of a sedimentation rate test done from a sample drawn on the 15th?
Okay. I know it's in here. Here it is.
May I
Thank
approach,
God.
Your Honor?
Yes, you may.
And Doctor, let me get the page number then, so that I'll have a reference on that. This is on page, I think, 450 for council's information. Doctor, this form, and Your Honor, may this be marked as 509, please?
Yes, People's 509.
And if Mr. Fairlow, you're going to have to move it down. Doctor, that shows a sedimentation rate of 24, is that correct?
That's correct.
That's handwritten, is that correct?
That's correct.
What's the source for that?
Our lab in our office.
I'm sorry?
Our lab in our office.
So that was a test that was done in your office?
That's correct.
The other test results were sent out?
The other test results were sent out. In other words, we did an initial CBC. You can see that that's part of it, so that's its complete blood count because we wanted to know instantly what his white blood count was.
Done in your office?
Done in our office, and
That-
including a sedimentation rate.
That has a computer-generated printout, does it not?
Yes, it does.
Why is there not a similar formalized printout of the sedimentation rate?
Because at that time we didn't have the computer software to print it all out.
Now, you had a second sedimentation rate test run on a sample from the 17th, is that correct?
That's correct.
And what was the result on that?
The result on that was 17.
And that is marginally elevated, is that correct?
I would say they're both marginally elevated.
Not of great significance to you, is it?
I would say mild elevation, probably a shoulder shrug. You don't know which way to interpret it, but certainly not sky high.
Are you familiar with the term pathognomonic?
Yes, I am.
What does that term mean medically?
Well, pathognomonic would mean something where you see a result and it's compelling evidence toward a certain diagnosis.
Would it be accurate to say, just given what you testify, that a sedimentation rate of 17 or 24 would not be considered pathognomonic for an acute episode of rheumatoid arthritis?
No, it would not.
Is that an accurate statement that I just made?
Again, rheumatoid arthritis is very difficult because it's not a lab test disease. Rheumatoid arthritis is a clinical disease, and the diagnosis itself is based on 7 clinical criteria, only one of which is really a lab test and one of which is a x-ray. So usually rheumatologists, in contradistinction to many other medical subspecialties, don't rely that heavily on lab tests, although they certainly have a role. And as far as I'm concerned, when I saw that result instantly, That's part of the reason why I didn't pursue rheumatoid arthritis initially, because I was led away from it by these initial three results that you've pointed out. And that's why I was going the osteoarthritis route initially in my mind, not the rheumatoid arthritis route as a cause of all or a preponderance of his orthopedic joint complaints.
Now, as you testified, I believe you said in arrears several times. You got information after June 17th of prior medical care Mr. Simpson had received, is that correct?
That's correct.
And one aspect of that information was from Dr. Maltz?
That's correct.
The person who holds himself out as a rheumatologist?
That's correct.
Now, did you ever,
Sustain. Rephrase the question.
Doctor, do you know whether Dr. Maltz is board certified in rheumatology?
I have not reviewed his exact credentials.
Do you know whether he's board certified in internal medicine?
I have not reviewed his exact credentials.
Did you ever get Dr. Maltz's records?
Yes, I did.
When did you get those records?
Probably several months ago.
And in fact, you spoke to Dr. Maltz for the first time, did you not, on June 27th of 1994?
That's correct.
So was it accurate to say that you felt nothing from your evaluations of the 15th or 17th dictated an immediate consultation with Dr. Maltz?
Correct.
And in getting the records from Dr. Maltz, did you find that in 1992, when Mr. Simpson had complaints that had him go to Dr. Maltz, that Dr. Maltz had a sedimentation rate test run? Did you find that to be the case?
I'm not that familiar with his record, so if you could tell me what it was, I'd believe you.
Your Honor, I have another document. May this be marked as the people's, I guess,
10. 510.
and it's page 686. This is a,
Have the original so the doctor can see it's
I buy that.
You can read that?
Sure.
Okay.
well, if the doctor, I'm not sure the doctor has an original. I think he has a copy, and we got a copy
Right.
some way.
Right.
Unfortunately, the date, I'm not sure if that's June 27th, 1992. Probably not. I'm not sure what month it is, but whatever it is, if Mr. Farrell will just leave it right there. Do you see where it says, looks like ESR 34?
Yes, I do.
Is that a sedimentation rate test result?
Yeah, it's a erythrocyte sedimentation rate, 34 millimeters per hour.
And is it accurate to say, from your understanding of rheumatology, doctor, that a patient tends to have a pattern, that when there are acute episodes of an onset of the inflammation causing symptoms of discomfort and so forth, that a pattern continues such that you would see a similar sedimentation rate result in earlier and later episodes?
I'm not really aware of any research that shows, a similar sedimentation rate with each flare, so I really can't comment on that. I have no knowledge that that is in fact factual.
You do not hold yourself out as an expert in rheumatology?
No, I do not.
All right. Would you describe a 34 as something of greater significance to you if you had that result than the 24 or the 17?
Honestly, I regarded everything in my own mind up in that range as modestly, mildly elevated. So no, I wouldn't say there's much of a difference between 24 and 34, very frankly.
Now, incidentally, I think you mentioned that from your understanding of rheumatology, that it tends to be a bilateral, a symmetrical kind of disease. A fancy way of saying if you see something on the left middle finger, you should expect to see something on the right middle finger, that kind of thing, correct?
I agree, and that in fact is one of the 7 diagnostic criteria for rheumatoid arthritis.
When you examined in the orthopedic examination of June 15th, did you see such symmetry between the left and right hands of Mr. Simpson?
There wasn't striking similarity because the left wrist was so much more, was severely involved, and the right wrist seemed relatively normal.
And you said the grip test, you did a grip test on both hands?
Yes, I did.
And in your opinion, they were both normal, is that
Right,
correct?
that's listed under the motor in the neurologic exam.
Doctor, would you show us, and perhaps you need me to be the patient, how the grip test you did was conducted? May I? Let's start with the right hand.
Okay, basically I'll say take my actually I do it with both because I want to compare simultaneously.
Okay.
So I'll just say
Like
squeeze
this?
as hard as you can. And then I'll sometimes fight to try to get out, and that basically assesses your grip.
Now, is there any way at that time that you can truly assess the level of cooperation of the patient
No, there's not.
if you retake the stand? And doctor, is it,
Although if the patient doesn't cooperate or it's weak, then you refer them for further tests, including EMG and whatnot, and you may better assess that. But
doctor, is it important in evaluating patients to provide some record that is of some objective nature so that doctors who may see the patient down the line in time and who may not have been present for the earlier exams can evaluate any changes between your exam and later exams?
that's certainly helpful if you have that documentation ability, sure.
And without some objective standard for evaluating the grip test you did, how would a doctor be able to assess whether or not there's a change down the road, given your subjective evaluation that his grip test result was normal?
Well, if his grip was weak or one side was weaker than the other, then you would have to assume that there was a change that needed evaluating.
But weakness is a subjective evaluation. There are tests that quantify the grip strength, correct?
That's true, but if you have a firm, strong grip strength and it's equal on both sides, typically there's no need to further go into it. In other words, you can keep doing tests. You can say, I'm healthy, and you can do an EKG and a stress test and a stress thallium, and then you can, are you going to do an angiogram on everyone? How far do you push on someone where your initial tests are revealing general normalcy?
And that's why you didn't have any further orthopedic tests ordered from the June 15th examination, right?
For the grip, that's correct.
Or for anything else.
Now, there is a plan, put appropriately or not, to have him see an orthopedist in the future for his ankle and knee problems, which I didn't think were commensurate with a good quality of life and with the ability to play golf in a pain-free state. So there was a plan, but certainly that was not something that needed to be done over a very brief period of time.
A number of areas I want to talk about, but I have just a few minutes to talk before we break for the day, apparently. You talked about observing what you thought to be somewhat ragged edges in at least one, if not more, of the cuts on Mr. Simpson's hand. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Doctor, when a person sustains an injury like that, however it was caused, is there an immunological reaction that releases something called phagocytes, Phagocytes, into the injured area?
Actually, initially in the first 24 hours, it's inflammatory cells, so it's more neutrophils would come in within the first 24 hours. So phagocytes is a later stage, and that actually monocytes is a better name for that cell, and that typically won't arrive at the site of the injury until more like the 2nd to the 5th day.
All right, and you were seeing Mr. Simpson on the 15th of June, is that correct?
That's correct.
And assuming that these injuries were sustained in the evening of June 12th, that would now mean the examination is taking place almost 3 days later, 2.5 to closing in on 3 days later, right?
That's correct.
I think you should phrase that as a hypothetical question.
Okay, sure. Assuming, doctor, that these injuries were sustained, some or all, on June 12th, around 10:15 in the evening, and your examination is taking place between noon and 2 o'clock in the afternoon on June 15th, we've got more than 2.5 days that have passed, correct?
Correct.
And if we'll use your term monocytes, the monocytes you would expect could have been already working on the injured area, right?
Assuming that hypothetical situation, yes.
And doctor, in fact, don't such cells, in essence, eat up the damaged area before the body starts to lay down new cells?
That's correct.
And by eating up the damaged area, it creates a ragged appearance, does it not?
It creates erythema, a redness around the rim. The ragged edge that I was referring to specifically on the left 4th index finger was the slight snake-like appearance, the in and out components, rather than just a nice smooth slit like you might expect with more like a surgical knife or some other instrument of that nature.
My question, though, doctor, was will such monocytes, phagocytes if you want to use my term, leave evidence of a ragged appearance to the area of the injured tissue where they have begun to work?
Right where the point of the incision is, I don't believe so. What happens is, especially the wound over the third was widened because that was different than the other ones because it was right at a joint line. And so what happens is there's kind of this fibrinous exudate that this it's a scab basically that the yellow stuff that comes out after cuts secretes in there. And that wound, then the one here was substantially more open than his other wounds. Your question, and I understand it, is when you look at the edge, can you tell if it's a serrated or an undulating line or a straight slice? And is that affected by these several days of this battle going on, first with the inflammatory, then the monocyte phase before the collagen and the scarring stage sets in? And certainly with relative hydration and dehydration, you could get edges that might potentially confuse you. I'd have to say that that's probably true.
And doctor, you said in response to Mr. Shapiro's question that a knife could give the appearance of a cut that you believe was due to glass. Is that correct?
I think there are certain glass cuts that can mimic knife cuts.
And there are knife cuts that can mimic glass cuts, right?
I think with a knife, if you're a surgeon, you can mimic a lot of things.
Well, doctor, in your experience in the ER room with respect to, I'll use the term sharp force injuries from a sharp knife. In general, the history is not terribly important to you if you see a wound that is bleeding, right?
No, that's not true because obviously the first thing you want to know in a wound that's bleeding is what's the infection? What's the time that the wound has been opened, because we know in the first 6 to 8 hours bacteria multiply, and if that wound happened to be caused by a tooth where you have 100 million bacteria per milliliter, that's very important. So the history is crucial in cuts as well as every other part, unless the person is bleeding in such a state that you feel their hemodynamic status is going to be compromised and you have to act quickly to ligate the artery bleeding.
Well, doctor, in the kinds of cuts that you saw Mr. Simpson had, these were not life-threatening, obviously.
No, they were not.
But when you see such cuts in an emergency room, one of the issues is, do I have to suture it or is it going to heal naturally, right?
That's absolutely correct.
And that has more to do with the depth of the injury than the source of the injury, correct?
There are many factors that go into whether or not you will suture a wound, including depth, position over movable joints, cosmetic factors, and convenience factors.
But the question was, it's more important the depth than worrying about the cause, correct?
It's more important the depth. You want to do it in the cheapest way possible, and obviously very deep lesions are less likely to heal spontaneously than very superficial injuries.
Your Honor, wherever the court wishes to take a recess.
Sounds good to me. All right, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to take our recess for the noon hour. Please remember all my admonitions to you. Don't discuss the case amongst yourselves. Don't form any opinions about the case. Don't conduct any deliberations until the matter has been submitted to you. Do not allow anybody to communicate with you with regard to the case. As far as the jury is concerned, we'll stand in recess until 9 a.m. on Monday. Doctor, you may step down. You're ordered to return Monday morning, 9 o'clock. All right, we'll stand in recess.